Oh my God.
They called him the broke rancher of Bitter Creek, a man with dust on his boots, debts on his back, and nothing left but an old hat and a dream. Then one day, at a shabby county auction, he spotted her. A trembling, mud-caked foal, no bigger than a shepherd dog, eyes wide with fear. The auctioneer laughed. "Who'll give me $1?" Silence. 50 cents? A few chuckles echoed across the barn. But the rancher, he raised his hand. No one knew that $50 would change his life and the history of that small western town forever, because that tiny foal, abandoned and frail, would grow into something the world hadn't seen in generations. A legend born from dust, heart, and a little faith. Sometimes the wildest fortunes come from the most broken beginnings. And this is one of those stories. If you love true Wild West stories that warm the heart and stir the soul, then saddle up with us here at MR West Legends. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances, subscribe to join our growing ranch of story lovers, and share this video with anyone who could use a reminder that miracles often come in muddy boots. The wind never stopped in Bitter Creek. It howled through the dry grass and rattled the broken boards of old barns like ghosts telling secrets. And on most mornings when the sun rolled over the hills, you could find one man already awake, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. His name was Earl Dawson, and around these parts, folks called him the Broke Rancher. Earl wasn't always broke. There was a time when his ranch stretched as far as you could ride in a day, when his cattle branded the hills like living gold. But years of drought, a busted water well, and a bad deal with the bank had stripped him down to almost nothing. He'd sold off most of his herd, pawned his old saddle, and even let his hired hands go one by one. Now it was just him, a couple of half-starved chickens, and silence. Sometimes he'd talk to the land, like an old friend that had turned its back on him. "Don't reckon you owe me anything," he'd mutter, "but I sure could use a little luck." Luck, though, was in short supply in Bitter Creek. The county auction won. Saturday morning, Earl hitched up his rusted truck and drove down to the county fairgrounds. It was auction day, a place where old ranchers tried to trade misery for a few dollars. There was hay to buy, old tools to sell, and horses of every kind, some proud and glossy, others broken, ribs showing under dull coats. Earl wasn't there to buy anything. He barely had 2 nickels to rub together. But a rancher goes to auctions like a preacher goes to church. It's where you see life, where you remember what hope looks like. The air smelled of manure and fried dough. Laughter and the sharp ring of the auctioneer's voice cut through the morning. Earl leaned against the fence, sipping weak coffee, watching one horse after another go under the hammer. "Lot 27, fine gelding. Who'll start me at 200? A few paddles rose. The price climbed. Then another lot. Then another. Earl's mind drifted, mostly to how he'd keep the lights on next month. That's when he saw her.
At first, he thought it was a stray dog. But when the handler let her out, the crowd chuckled. She was a tiny foal, barely 3 months old, legs wobbling like a newborn calf's. Her coat was patchy with mud, and her mane tangled with burrs. She looked lost, frightened, and far too young to be away from her mother. Even the auctioneer paused a moment, scratching his head. "All right, folks," the man barked. "This one to rescue. Found her by the old railway fence. No papers, no history. Who'll start me at $1? Silence. The foal gave a soft, trembling whinny, more like a cry for help. A few ranchers snickered. Someone muttered, "Ain't worth the rope around her neck." Another joked, 50 cents and I'll take her for dog food." Earl felt something twist in his chest. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. Maybe it was the way her eyes met his, wide, searching, almost human. Something in that stare said, "I'm not done yet." 50 cents, the auctioneer repeated, half laughing. Earl's hand went up before his brain caught up. "Sold the man in the hat," the auctioneer shouted. The crowd chuckled as Earl walked up to claim her. 50 cents, half $1, the cheapest sale of the day. On the drive back to Bitter Creek, Earl kept glancing at the foal through the cracked rear-view mirror. She stood unsteady in the trailer, her eyes darting with every bump. He could almost hear the voices of the townsfolk in his head. You bought a hopeless foal when you can't feed yourself? Maybe they were right. But Earl didn't buy her because it made sense. He bought her because, for the first time in a long while, something inside him felt alive again. When they reached the ranch, the foal refused to come out. Earl coaxed her gently, talking to her like an old friend. "Come on now, girl. Ain't much of a home, but it's yours if you want it." Finally, she stepped down, her hooves touching the dry ground. Earl smiled softly. "We'll call you Penny. Seems fitting, don't it?" Penny blinked, as if she understood. The first few nights were rough. Penny wouldn't eat. She cried through the night, calling for a mother who'd never come. Earl sat by her pen, lantern burning low, whispering stories of the old days, of cattle drives and thunder rolling across the plains. Sometimes she'd fall asleep mid-cry, her head resting on his boot. Earl never moved until morning. Neighbors stopped by to check on the fool who bought a dead-end foal. They offered half-hearted advice and sideways glances. One even said, "You should have just let her go, Earl. Mercy's cheaper than feed." Earl only nodded. But deep down, he wasn't ready to give up. Not on her, not yet. Weeks passed, and something started to change. Penny began to stand taller, her legs steadier. Her coat started to shine beneath the dust. She followed Earl everywhere, into the barn, across the field, even up to the porch where she'd nuzzle at his old boots. One afternoon, Earl took her out to the pasture for the first time. A tumbleweed rolled by, and Penny chased it, bucking and kicking with wild joy. Earl laughed, a sound he hadn't made in months. Maybe she wasn't just surviving. Maybe she was meant for something more. He didn't know it then, but that little foal would turn his name from the broke rancher into something far greater. And in the heart of Bitter Creek, the legend of Earl Dawson and Penny, the 50-cent miracle, was just beginning. Morning in Bitter Creek came early and cold. The kind of morning where the sky turns silver before the sun finds the courage to climb over the hills. Earl Dawson was already in the barn, his breath fogging the air, a bucket of feed in his hands. And right there, standing a little taller than she had yesterday, was Penny. She was still small, her ribs showing faintly. But there was a light in her eyes now, a spark that hadn't been there before. When Earl opened the stall, she let out a soft whinny, the kind that made him smile despite himself. "Well, look at you," he said softly. "Ain't no one laughing now, huh?" Penny stomped a tiny hoof, playful, proud, and maybe, just maybe, she understood him. A town that loves to talk. By the time word spread that Earl had spent his last 50 cents on a half-dead foal, the whole town had an opinion. At the general store, folks chuckled as they packed flour and feed. "Old Earl's lost it," one man said. "Can't save his ranch, so he savons strays now." 50 cents? Another laughed. "Guess that's all he's worth these days." But out on that quiet ranch, miles from their gossip, Earl was busy doing something nobody else bothered to, believing. He built Penny a small corral, patched from old fence boards and wire. He fed her the best hay he could afford, which wasn't much. And at night, when the wind howled through the valley, he'd bring her inside the barn, cover her with an old blanket, and sit with her until the storm passed. Sometimes he'd say, half to her, half to himself, "You and me, kid, we ain't much on paper." But maybe that's how stories start. Weeks turned into months. Penny began to grow, not just in size, but in spirit. There was something different about her. She was gentler than most foals, but quicker too. She listened when Earl spoke, almost as if she understood his words. One morning, as Earl mended a broken gate, Penny came trotting up beside him, nudging his shoulder. "What is it, girl?" he asked, chuckling. She pawed at the ground, then darted off, circling the corral in smooth, fluid strides. Earl paused, wiping sweat from his brow, watching in awe. There was grace in the way she moved, effortless, elegant, like she was born to run. A few weeks later, Earl decided to take her out for her first real ride across the open field. Of course, she was still too small to carry weight, but he wanted to see what she could do. He opened the gate and Penny bolted. Fast. Faster than he'd ever seen a young horse move. Dust rose behind her like a golden storm. Earl whistled low. "Well, I'll be 50 cents never ran that good." The neighbors came by now and then, curious about the miracle foal. Some brought feed, others just brought their opinions. "She's healthy, I'll give you that." One man said, leaning on the fence, "But what are you going to do with her? Ain't no papers, no pedigree. You can't race her, can't breed her for show." Earl just shrugged. Didn't buy her for what she could do, bought her for what she deserved. That answer didn't sit right with most folks. In a town where every penny mattered, who'd spend 50 cents on hope? But Earl wasn't just keeping Penny alive anymore. He was learning from her. Every morning she'd greet him with a nudge, as if to say, "Get up, we've got work to do." And every evening, as the sun melted into gold, she'd run, not from fear, but from joy. Something about her freedom reminded Earl of what he used to be. It happened one spring afternoon. A local horse breeder, Cal Peterson, stopped by Bitter Creek looking to buy hay. Cal was one of those men who thought he'd seen it all. Fine horses, fast horses, expensive horses. He wasn't expecting much from Earl's dusty ranch. Then he saw Penny. She was grazing near the fence line, her coat catching the sunlight like bronze. When she lifted her head, Cal frowned. "That your foal?" "Sure is," Earl said proudly. "Don't look like much," Cal muttered, "but she's got something." He watched as Penny suddenly took off, cutting across the pasture with sharp, perfect strides, agile and sure. Cal blinked. "You train her yourself?" Earl smiled. "Didn't train her at all. She just runs." Cal rubbed his chin. "Tell you what, Earl, if she keeps that up, you might have something special on your hands. Ever thought about racing her?" Earl laughed out loud. "Racing? Cal, I can't even afford a saddle that fits her." But deep down, the idea planted itself like a seed in his heart. Weeks later, with Cal's help, Earl entered Penny in a small-town race, more for fun than fame. The other racers were seasoned stock, tall, sleek horses with professional riders. Penny was a runt, still small, still young, wearing a patched-up bridle that had seen better days. When they lined up at the start, laughter rippled through the crowd. "Look, it's Earl's 50-cent wonder," someone shouted. Earl stood by the rail, heart pounding. He didn't expect to win. He just wanted Penny to run, to prove to herself she belonged. The gun fired. Dust exploded. Penny stumbled at first, her legs unsure, her stride uncertain. Then, as if remembering who she was, she found her rhythm. Her hooves struck the ground in a perfect beat. Quick, light, relentless. One by one, she passed the others. By the final stretch, the crowd had fallen silent. Penny crossed the finish line first. Earl couldn't breathe. The same people who laughed were now cheering. Someone yelled, "What in the blazes? Where'd that horse come from?" Earl just whispered, "From 50 cents and a little faith." By sundown, word had spread across Bitter Creek. Earl's foal had beaten every horse in town. People called it a fluke, luck, beginner's fortune. But those who saw her run knew better. There was something in that horse, heart, fire, something unteachable. Earl didn't care about trophies or prize money. As he brushed her down that evening, Penny leaned into him, her eyes calm, her body warm against the cool air. He smiled. "Guess we showed him, huh, girl?" She let out a soft snort, almost like laughter. And just like that, the story of the 50-cent miracle began to ripple across the prairie. No one knew it yet, but that little foal was about to change everything, not just for Earl, but for the entire town that once pitied him. The next morning, Bitter Creek woke to whispers. At the diner, the barber shop, the feed store, everyone was talking about it. The broke rancher's foal beat Peterson's racehorse. Nah, can't be true. But it was true, and in a town where truth traveled slower than dust, Penny's story moved like wildfire. For the first time in years, folks were driving out to the Dawson ranch just to see her. Earl would catch them leaning against the fence, eyes wide, trying to make sense of the little brown mare that outran a town full of pedigree. They'd ask, "What's she eating?" What's a bloodline? Earl would just smile. Ain't got no fancy bloodline. Just a big heart. And that line, those 5 simple words, became the heartbeat of what came next. Life at the ranch changed, not overnight, but steady as the rising sun. The same corral that once echoed with silence now rang with life. Earl training, Penny galloping, hooves striking the dirt like drums of hope. Earl had never been much of a horse trainer, but Penny seemed to teach him how to be one. She was quick to learn, quicker to forgive. If she tripped, she tried again. If the saddle didn't fit, she waited patiently as Earl adjusted it. Every morning, they pushed a little farther, and every evening, they watched the sunset together in quiet understanding. It wasn't just about speed anymore. It was about purpose, the spark of belief. Soon enough, the local newspaper came calling. A young reporter named Sarah Miller arrived in a dusty truck, notebook in hand. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "folks are saying you've got a horse that came back from nothing. Mind if I see for myself?" Earl chuckled. "Seeing's believing, miss." When Penny galloped across the field, Sarah dropped her pen. There was something mesmerizing about the sight. This once-forgotten foal, muscles rippling, mane flying like fire, carving through the open prairie as if she owned it. That afternoon, Sarah's story hit the front page of the Bitter Creek Gazette. 50-cent foal runs like the wind. Local rancher's miracle horse captures hearts. The headline spread beyond the valley. Nearby towns started calling, offering small race invitations and sponsorships. For Earl, it wasn't about fame. It was about survival. The prize money meant feed, repairs, maybe even a chance to buy back the land he'd lost. And so, with a patched trailer and a heart full of hope, he and Penny hit the road. The first real race was in Silver Junction, a dusty town 2 hours west. The track was rough, the crowd rowdy, and the stakes high. Too high for a rancher who still owed more than he owned. But as Earl led Penny into the lineup, he felt something shift. The laughter he'd once feared now only made him smile. Penny stood calm, her head low, breathing slow. Around her, the other horses danced nervously, their riders boasting and betting. Earl leaned close, whispering, "Don't mind them, girl. Just run like you always do, free." The starter's gun cracked like thunder, and Penny ran. Not just fast, beautifully. She didn't just move, she flowed. Her stride long and confident, each hoof finding rhythm like a song she'd been born to play. By the final lap, the crowd was on its feet. The underdog from Bitter Creek crossed first. Again, the announcer's voice boomed. And the winner, by 2 lengths, Penny Dawson, the 50-cent miracle. Earl's hat flew in the air as cheers swallowed the desert wind. Back home, Bitter Creek changed with every race Penny won. The general store started selling postcards of her photo. Kids painted Team Penny on wooden signs. Even the same men who'd once mocked Earl now tipped their hats when he passed. Earl, though, stayed humble. He still fixed fences, still worked the land, still talked to Penny like she was the only one listening. Because she was. One evening, he found himself sitting on the porch, cup of coffee steaming in his hands, Penny grazing in the twilight. He whispered, "Funny thing, huh? I spent half my life chasing fortune, and it found me for 50 cents. Penny lifted her head, ears flicking. In her eyes, Earl saw something deeper than luck, something like destiny. Then came a letter. A man from Dallas, owner of a famous racing stable, had heard about Penny. He offered Earl a deal, $250,000 to buy her. $250,000 for the horse he'd bought with pocket change. Earl sat by the fire that night, the letter trembling in his hands. He could clear every debt, rebuild his ranch. Live easy. But every time he looked at Penny, grazing quietly outside the window, his chest tightened. He knew what that money would mean, but he also knew what she meant. When morning came, he crumpled the letter, tossed it into the flames, and smiled. "Some things," he said softly, "ain't for sale. Legacy in motion." By summer's end, Penny wasn't just a horse. She was a legend. Every race she ran carried the weight of her story. The broke rancher, the forgotten foal, the 50-cent miracle. People came from miles around to see them, not because they were rich or polished, but because they represented something real, something American at its core: grit, grace, and second chances. And while others saw fame and fortune, Earl saw something simpler. He saw redemption. The land that once mocked him now bloomed with life. The ranch that had fallen silent now echoed with laughter, visitors, and the steady beat of hooves against the soil. One evening, as the orange sky bled into twilight, Sarah the reporter returned for a follow-up story. She asked, "Earl, what do you think made Penny so special?" He thought for a long moment, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe," he said, "she just needed someone who didn't quit on her." Sarah smiled. "And maybe you needed her just the same." Earl nodded. "Yeah, maybe we both did." The dust had settled, but the legend was still rising. And deep down, everyone in Bitter Creek knew Penny wasn't done yet. Because sometimes a miracle isn't just what saves you, it's what reminds you who you are. The sun rose over Bitter Creek, like a promise. The air was cool, the sky painted with streaks of gold, and the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the valley. Earl Dawson stood by the fence, watching Penny run, strong, proud, and free. He smiled quietly, thinking back to the day he bought her for 50 cents. Back when she could barely stand. Back when he could barely stand himself. Life had changed more than he could have ever dreamed. The small races turned into state ones. The crowds grew. The stakes rose. And with every victory, Penny's name carried farther across the West, whispered in towns Earl had never even visited. They called her the Miracle Mare of Bitter Creek. But for Earl, she was still just Penny, the little foal who reminded him what faith looked like. The big stage one crisp autumn morning, a letter arrived from Denver. It was an invitation to the Western Frontier Derby, the biggest race west of the Mississippi. Prize money, $1 million. Earl held the letter for a long time, silent. He wasn't man of greed, but he knew what that kind of money meant. Not for luxury, but for legacy. He could rebuild a ranch, open a shelter for abandoned horses, maybe even give other Pennies a chance to rise. "Looks like our trails led us here, girl," he said softly, running his hand along Penny's neck. She nuzzled him in reply, calm and ready. It wasn't just another race. It was destiny. The racetrack glowed under floodlights as mist hung over the morning fields. Trainers bustled, cameras flashed, and the sound of snorting horses filled the air. Earl fell out of place in his old leather boots and faded hat. But when Penny stepped off the trailer, the whisper started. "Is that her? The 50-cent horse? Doesn't look like much." Earl chuckled under his breath. They said that before, he thought. As dawn broke, he walked her to the starting gate. She moved with quiet grace. No nerves, no hesitation. Just heart. He leaned close to her ear and whispered, "No matter what happens, you already made me rich." The crowd roared as the announcer's voice echoed across the grandstand. And in Lane 7 from Bitter Creek Ranch, the miracle mare herself, Penny Dawson. Earl's hand shook as he adjusted her bridle. Then the gate snapped open. The world exploded into motion. Dust flew. Hooves thundered. Penny stumbled at the start, just for a breath, and gasps rippled through the crowd. But then she found her stride. Her legs stretched out like wind and thunder combined. One by one, she closed the gap, her hooves pounding in rhythm with every heartbeat in the stands. By the halfway mark, she was side by side with the favorite, a stallion worth $500,000. "Come on, girl," Earl shouted, his voice swallowed by the roar. The two horses thundered down the final stretch, neck and neck. Time slowed. Dust hung in the air like gold mist. And then, with one last surge, Penny surged forward, her nose crossing the line just inches ahead. The crowd erupted. Earl froze. Then his hat flew sky high as tears filled his eyes. She'd done it. Against every odd, against every doubt, she'd done it. When they led Penny into the winner's circle, the cameras flashed like wildfire. Reporters shouted questions, fans cheered, and strangers reached to touch the horse that had made history. But Earl didn't care for the noise. He stood beside her, hand on her neck, whispering through tears, "You did it, girl. You did it for both of us." That day, the prize money made him a millionaire, but the title made him something better, a legend, He used the winnings not for mansions or cars, but to buy back every acre of land he'd lost. Then, he opened a small horse sanctuary on the edge of Bitter Creek, naming it Penny's Promise. It became a haven for lost, injured, or abandoned horses, the forgotten souls of prairie. And every child who visited the ranch would hear the story. How a poor rancher with nothing but faith bought a broken foal for 50 cents. And she turned his life and his town into gold. Years passed. Penny grew older, her muzzle dusted with gray, but her spirit never dimmed. Every evening, she and Earl would take a slow ride across the ridge, watching the sun sink behind the hills. Sometimes he'd talk to her softly, the way old friends do. "Never thought I'd see this place full again," he'd say. "You gave me more than I ever deserved." When Penny finally passed, peacefully, under the same oak tree she used to run beneath, the whole town came to her farewell. They buried her at the top of the ridge overlooking the ranch, with a simple wooden sign that read, "Penny, the 50-cent miracle who made 1,000,000 dreams come true." Years later, when Earl himself grew old, a young reporter visited him again. She asked, "Mr. Dawson, after all these years, what's the lesson you've learned from Penny?" Earl smiled, eyes still shining like the Bitter Creek sunrise. He said, "People think this story is about money, but it ain't. It's about worth. You can't measure worth in dollars, bloodlines, or trophies. It's in heart. It's in not giving up on others or yourself." He paused, looking out toward the ridge. "Funny thing," he said softly, "I bought her for 50 cents, but she bought me my life back." And so, the story of Penny and Earl Dawson became part of Western folklore, a tale told by ranchers, dreamers, and wanderers alike. Even today, when the wind runs through Bitter Creek, some say you can still hear the soft echo of hooves and the whisper of a man laughing through tears. Because legends don't just live in history books. They live in every soul brave enough to believe when nobody else does. If this story touched your heart, partner, don't ride off just yet. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances, and subscribe to MR, West Legends, where every tale from the Wild West reminds us that hope still rides, even through dust and storm. And remember, sometimes all it takes is 50 cents and a little faith to change the world. Sunrise,